American writer J. Saunders Redding describes the arrival of a ship in North America in the year 1619 as sails furled, flag drooping at her round stern. She rode the tide in from the sea. She was a strange ship, indeed, by all accounts, a frightening ship, a ship of mystery. Whether she was a trader, privateer, or a man of war, no one knows. Through her bulwarks, black-mouthed cannon yawned. The flag she flew was Dutch, her crew a motley. Her port of call, an English settlement, Jamestown, in the colony of Virginia. She came, she traded, and shortly afterwards was gone. Probably no ship in modern history has carried a more portentous freight. Her cargo, 20 slaves. There is not a country in world history in which racism has been more important for so long a time as the United States. And the problem of, quote-unquote, the color line, as W.E.B. Du Bois put it, is still with us. So it is more than a purely historical question to ask. How does it start? And an even more urgent question, how might it end? Or to put it differently, is it possible for whites and blacks to live together without hatred? If history can help answer these questions, then the beginnings of slavery in North America, a continent where we can trace the coming of the first whites and the first blacks, might supply at least a few clues. Some historians think those first blacks in Virginia were considered as servants, like the white indentured servants brought from Europe. But the strong probability is that even if they were listed as quote-unquote servants, they were viewed as being different from white servants, were treated differently, and in fact were slaves. In any case, slavery developed quickly into a regular institution, into the normal labor relation of blacks to whites in the New World. With it developed that special racial feeling, whether hatred or contempt or pity or patronization, that accompanied the inferior position of blacks in America for the next 350 years. That combination of inferior status and derogatory thought we call racism. Everything in the experience of the first white settlers act as a pressure for the enslavement of blacks. The Virginians of 1619 were desperate for labor, to grow enough food to stay alive. Among them were survivors from the winter of 1609-1610, the quote-unquote starving time, when, crazed for want of food, they roamed the woods for nuts and berries, dug up graves to eat the corpses, and unalived in batches until 500 colonists were reduced to 60. In the journals of the House of Burgesses of Virginia is a document of 1619 which tells of the first 12 years of the Jamestown colony. The first settlement had 100 persons who had one small ladle of barley per meal. When more people arrived, there was even less food. Many of the people lived in cave-like holes dug into the ground, and in the winter of 1609-1610, they were described as driven through insufferable hunger to eat those things which nature most abhorred, the flesh and excrements of man, as well of our own nation as of an Indian, digged by some out of his grave after he had lain buried 3 days, and wholly devoured him. Others, envying the better state of body of any whom hunger has not yet so much wasted as their own, lay wait and threatened to unalive and eat them. One among them slew his wife as she slept in his bosom, cut her in pieces, salted her, and fed upon her till he had clean devoured all parts, saving her head. A petition by 30 colonists to the House of Burgesses, complaining against the 12-year governorship of Sir Thomas Smith, said, "In those 12 years of Sir Thomas Smith, his government, we averred that the colony for the most part remained in great want and misery under most severe and cruel laws. The allowance in those times for a man was only 8 ounces of meal and half pint of peas for a day, moldy, rotten, full of cobwebs and maggots, loathsome to man and not fit for beasts, which forced many to flee for relief to the savage enemy, who being taken again were put to sundry deaths, as by hanging, shooting, and breaking upon the wheel, of whom one for stealing 2 or 3 pints of oatmeal had a bodkin thrust through his tongue and was tied with a chain to a tree until he starved. The Virginians needed labor to grow corn for sustenance, to grow tobacco for export. They had just figured out how to grow tobacco, and in 1617 they sent off the first cargo to England, finding that, like all pleasurable drugs tainted with moral disapproval, it brought a high price. The planters, despite their high religious talk, were not going to ask questions about something so profitable. They couldn't force Indians to work for them as Columbus had done. They were outnumbered, and while with superior firearms they could massacre Indians, they would face massacre in return. They could not capture them and keep them enslaved. The Indians were tough, resourceful, defiant, and at home in these woods, as the transplanted Englishmen were not. White servants had not yet been brought over in sufficient quantity. Besides, they did not come out of slavery and did not have to do more than contractor labor for a few years to get their passage and a start in the New World. As for the free white settlers, many of them were skilled craftsmen or even men of leisure back in England, who were so little inclined to work the land that John Smith, in those early years, had to declare a kind of martial law, organize them into work gangs, and force them into the fields for survival. There may have been a kind of frustrated rage at their own ineptitude, at the Indian superiority at taking care of themselves, that made the Virginians especially ready to become the masters of slaves. Edmund Morgan imagines their mood as he writes in his book, American Slavery, American Freedom. This is what he writes in his book. If you were a colonist, you knew that your technology was superior to the Indians. You knew that you were civilized and they were savages. But your superior technology had proved insufficient to extract anything. The Indians, keeping to themselves, laughed at your superior methods and lived from the land more abundantly and with less labor than you did. And when your own people started deserting in order to live with them, it was too much. So you killed the Indians, tortured them, burned their village, burned their cornfields. It proved your superiority in spite of your failures, and you gave similar treatment to any of your own people who succumbed to their savage ways of life, but you still did not grow much corn. That's what he wrote in American Slavery, American Freedom. Black slaves were the answer, and it was natural to consider imported blacks as slaves, even if the institution of slavery would not be regularized and legalized for several decades, because by 1619 1 million blacks had already been brought from Africa to South America and the Caribbean to the Portuguese and Spanish colonies to work as slaves. 50 years before Columbus, the Portuguese took 10 African blacks to Lisbon. This was the start of a regular trade in slaves. African blacks had been stamped as slave labor for 100 years. So it would have been strange if those 20 blacks, forcibly transplanted to Jamestown and sold as objects to settlers anxious for a steadfast source of labor, were considered as anything but slaves. How's everybody doing? We're reading The People's History of the United States. We're on Chapter 2. Their helplessness made enslavement easier. The Indians were on their own land. The whites were in their own European culture. The blacks had been torn from their land and culture, forced into a situation where the heritage of language, dress, custom, family relations was bit by bit obliterated, except for the remnants that blacks could hold onto by sheer extraordinary persistence. Was their culture inferior and so subject to easy destruction? Inferior in military capability, yes, vulnerable to whites with guns and ships, but in no other way except that cultures that are different are often taken as inferior, especially when such a judgment is practical and profitable. Even militarily, while the Westerners could secure forts on the African coast, they were unable to subdue the interior and had to come to terms with its chiefs. The African civilization was as advanced in its own way as that of Europe, In certain ways, it was more admirable, but it also included cruelties, hierarchical privilege, and the readiness to sacrifice human lives for religion or profit. It was civilization of 100 million people using iron implements and skilled in farming. It had large urban centers and remarkable achievements in weaving, ceramics, sculpture. European travelers in the 16th century were impressed with the African kingdoms of Timbuktu and Mali. Hold on, give me 1 second. Something's biting me. Already stable and organized at a time when European states were just beginning to develop into the modern nation. In 1563, Ramusio, secretary of the rulers in Venice, wrote to the Italian merchants, quote, "Let them go and do business with the king of Timbuktu and Mali, and there is no doubt that they will be well received there with their ships and their goods and treated well and granted the favors they ask," end quote. A Dutch report around 1602 on the West African kingdom of Benin, or Benin, I don't know how, said, quote, "The town seemeth to be very great. When you enter it, you go into a great broad street, not paved, which seemeth to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Warmost street in Amsterdam. The houses in this town stand in good order, one close and even with the other, as the houses in Holland stand," end quote. The inhabitants of the Guinea coast were described by one traveler around 1680 as, quote, "very civil and good-natured people, easy to be dealt with, condescending to what Europeans require them in a civil way, and very ready to return double the presents we make them," end quote. Africa had a kind of feudalism like Europe based on agriculture and with hierarchies of lords and vassals. But African feudalism did not come, as did Europe's, out of the slave societies of Greece and Rome, which had destroyed ancient tribal life. In Africa, tribal life was still powerful, and some of its better features, a communal spirit, more kindness in law and punishment, still existed. And because the lords did not have the weapons that European lords had, they could not command obedience as easily. In his book, The African Slave Trade, Basil Davidson contrasts law in the Congo in the early 16th century with law in Portugal and England. In those European countries where the idea of private property was becoming powerful, theft was punished brutally. In England, even as late as 1740, a child can be hanged for stealing a rag of cotton. But in the Congo, communal life persisted. The idea of private property was a strange one, and thefts were punished with fines or various degrees of servitude. A Congolese leader told of the Portuguese legal codes, asked a Portuguese once teasingly, quote, "What is the penalty for Portugal for anyone who puts his feet on the ground," end quote. Slavery existed in the African states, and it was sometimes used by Europeans to justify their own slave trade. But as Davidson points out, the quote-unquote slaves of Africa were more like the serfs of Europe, in other words, like most of the population of Europe. It was a harsh servitude, but they had rights which slaves brought to America did not have, and they were, quote, "altogether different from the human cattle of the slave ships and the American plantations," end quote. In the Ashanti Kingdom of West Africa, one observer noted that, quote, "a slave might marry, own property, himself own a slave, swear an oath, be a competent witness, and ultimately became heir to his master. An Ashanti slave, 9 cases out of 10, possibly become an adopted member of the family, and in time his descendants so merged and intermarried with the owner's kinsmen that only a few would know their origin," end quote. One slave trader, John Newton, who became an anti-slavery leader, wrote about the people of what is now Sierra Leone. This is what he wrote. "The state of slavery among these wild barbarous people, as we esteem them, is much milder than in our colonies. For as, on the one hand, they have no land in higher cultivation like our West India plantations, and therefore no call for that excessive unintermitted labor, which exhausts our slaves. So on the other hand, no man is permitted to draw blood, even from a slave. African slavery is hardly to be praised, but it was far different from plantation or mining slavery in the Americas, which was lifelong, morally crippling, destructive of family ties. Without hope of any future, African slavery lacked two elements that made American slavery the most cruel form of slavery in history: the frenzy for limitless profit that comes from capitalistic agriculture, the reduction of the slave to less than human status by the use of racial hatred, with all that relentless clarity based on color, where white was master, black was slave. How's everybody doing? Okay, so we're going to continue with, this is chapter 2 of A People's History of the United States. Give me a second. Okay. In fact, it was because they came from a settled culture of tribal customs. There's a car going by. Oh, a truck. Oh. Customs and family ties of communal life and traditional ritual that African blacks found themselves especially helpless when removed from this. They were captured in the interior, sold on the coast, then shoved into pens with blacks of other tribes, often speaking different languages. The conditions of capture and sale were crushing affirmations to the black African of his helplessness in the face of superior force. The marches to the coast, sometimes for 1,000 miles, with people shackled around the neck under whip and gun, were death marches, in which 2 of every 5 blacks unalived. On the coast, they were kept in cages until they were picked and sold. One John Barbet, at the end of the 17th century, described these cages on the Gold Coast. As the slaves come down the feeder from the inland country, they are put into a booth or prison near the beach, and when the Europeans are to receive them, they are brought out onto a large plain where the ship's surgeons examine every part of every one of them, to the smallest member, men and women being stark naked. Such as are allowed good and sound are set on one side, marked on the breast with a red hot iron, imprinting the mark of the French, English, or Dutch companies. The branded slaves after this are returned to their former booths, where they await shipment, sometimes 10 to 15 days. They were packed aboard the slave ships in spaces not much bigger than coffins, chained together in the dark, wet slime of the ship's bottom, choking in the stench of their own excrement. Documents of the time described the conditions as: the height sometimes between decks was only 18 inches, so that unfortunate human beings could not turn around or even on their sides. The elevation being less than the breadth of their shoulders, and here they are usually chained to the decks by the neck and legs. In such a place, the sense of misery and suffocation is so great that they are driven to frenzy. On one occasion, hearing a great noise from below decks where the blacks were chained together, the sailors opened the hatches and found the slaves in different stages of suffocation, many unalive, having unalived others in desperate attempts to breathe. Slaves often jumped overboard to drown rather than continue their suffering. To one observer, a slave deck was, quote, so covered with blood and mucus that it resembled a slaughterhouse, end quote. Under these conditions, perhaps one of every three blacks transported overseas died, but the huge profits made it worthwhile for the slave trader, so the blacks were packed into the holds like fish. First the Dutch, then the English dominated the slave trade. By 1795, Liverpool had more than 100 ships carrying slaves and accounted for half of all European slave trade. Some Americans in New England entered the business, and in 1637, the first American slave ship, the Desire, sailed from Marblehead. Its holds were partitioned into racks, 2 feet by 6 feet, with leg irons and bars. By 1800, 10 to 15 million blacks had been transported as slaves to the Americas. representing perhaps 1/3 of those originally seized in Africa. It is roughly estimated that Africa lost 50 million human beings to unalive and slavery in those centuries we call the beginnings of modern Western civilization at the hands of slave traders and plantation owners in Western Europe and America, the countries deemed the most advanced in the world. In the year 1610, a Catholic priest in the Americas named Father Sandoval wrote back to a church functionary in Europe to ask if the capture, transport, and enslavement of African blacks was legal by church doctrine. A letter dated March 12, 1610 from Brother Louis Brandon to Father Sandoval gives the answer. Your Reverence writes me that you would like to know whether they who are sent to you your parts have been legally captured. To this I replied that I think your Reverence should have no scruples on this point, because this is a matter which has been questioned by the Board of Conscience in Lisbon, and all its members are learned and conscientious men. Nor did the bishops who were in South Tom, Cape Verde, and here in Laundo, all learned and virtuous men, find fault with it. We have been here ourselves for 40 years, and there have been among us very learned fathers. Never did they consider the trade as illicit. Therefore we and the fathers of Brazil put these slaves for our service without any scruple. So they said it was okay, religiously, I guess. I don't know. With all of this, the desperation of the Jamestown settlers for labor, the impossibility of using Indians, and the difficulty of using whites, the availability of blacks offered in greater and greater numbers by profit-seeking dealers in human flesh, and with such blacks possible to control because they had just gone through an ordeal which, if it did not unalive them, must have left them in a state of psychic and physical helplessness. Is it any wonder that such blacks were ripe for enslavement? And under these conditions, even if some blacks might have been considered servants, would blacks be treated the same as white servants? The evidence from the court records of colonial Virginia shows that in 1630, a white man named Hugh Davis was ordered, quote, to be soundly whipped for abusing himself by defiling his body and lying with a slave, end quote. 10 years later, 6 servants and a slave of Mr. Reynolds started to run away, while the whites received lighter sentences. Manuel to the slave to receive 30 stripes and to be burnt in the cheek with the letter R, and to work in shackle 1 year or more as his master shall see cause. Although slavery was not yet regularized or legalized in those first years, the lists of servants show blacks listed separately. A law passed in 1639 decreed all persons except, I'll call them slaves instead of, hold on, I got a spider web on me now. Were to get arms and ammunition, except the slaves were to get arms and ammunition, probably to fight off Indians. When in 1640 3 servants tried to run away, the 2 whites were punished with a lengthening of their service, but as the court put it, quote, the third being a slave named John Punch shall serve his master or his assigns for the time of his natural life, end quote. Also in 1640 we have the case of a slave woman servant, a black woman servant who begot a child with Robert Sweat, a white man. The court ruled that said that the black woman shall be whipped at the whipping post, and he said Sweat shall tomorrow in the forenoon do public penance for his offense at James City Church, end quote. This unequal treatment, this developing combination of contempt and oppression, feeling that an action which we call racism, was this the result of natural antipathy of white against black? The question is important. not just as a matter of historical accuracy, but because any emphasis on natural racism lightens the responsibility of the social system. If racism can't be shown to be natural, then it is the result of certain conditions, and we are impelled to eliminate those conditions. We have no way of testing the behavior of whites and blacks towards one another under favorable conditions, with no history of subordination, no money incentive for exploitation and enslavement, no desperation for survival requiring forced labor. All the conditions for black and white in 17th century America were the opposite of that, all powerfully directed towards antagonism and mistreatment. Under such conditions, even the slightest display of humanity between the races might be considered evidence of a basic human drive towards community. Sometimes it is noted that even before 1600, when the slave trade had just begun, before Africans were stamped by it literally and symbolically, the color black was distasteful. In England before 1600, it meant, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, quote, deeply stained with dirt, soiled, dirty, foul, having dark or deadly purposes, malignant, pertaining to or involving unaliving, deadly, baneful, disastrous, sinister, foul, iniquitous, atrocious, horribly wicked, indicating disgrace, censure, liability to punishment, etc. And Elizabethan poetry often used the color white in connection with beauty. It may be that in the absence of any other overriding factor, darkness and blackness associated with night and unknown would take on those meanings. But the presence of another human being is a powerful fact, and the conditions of that presence are crucial in determining whether an initial prejudice against a mere color divorced from humankind is turned into brutality and hatred. In spite of such preconceptions about blackness, in spite of special subordination of blacks in the Americas in the 17th century, there's evidence that where whites and blacks found themselves with common problems, common work, common enemy in their master, they behaved towards one another as equals. As one scholar of slavery, Kenneth Stamp, has put it, black and white servants of the 17th century were, quote, remarkably unconcerned about the physical differences, end quote. Black and white worked together, fraternized together. The very fact that laws had to be passed after a while to forbid such relations indicate the strength of that tendency. In 1661, a law was passed in Virginia that, quote, in case any English servant shall run away with company of any blacks, end quote, he would have to give special service for extra years to the master of the runaway slave. In 1691, Virginia provided for the banishment of any, quote, white man or woman being free who shall intermarry with a black person, mulatto, or Indian man or woman, bond or free, end quote. There is an enormous difference between a feeling of racial strangeness, perhaps fear, and the most enslavement of millions of black people that took place in the Americas. The transition from one to the other cannot be explained easily by quote-unquote natural tendencies. It is not hard to understand as the outcome of historical conditions. Let me see how many more pages. I think it goes to 38. Okay, so I'm on 32. Slavery grew as the plantation system grew. The reason is easily traceable to something other than natural racial repugnance. The number of arriving whites, whether free or indentured servants, was not enough to meet the need of the plantations. By 1700, in Virginia, there were 6,000 slaves, 1/12 of the population. By 1763, there were 170,000 slaves, about half the population. Blacks were easier to enslave than whites or Indians, but they were still not easy to enslave. From the beginning, the imported black men and women resisted their enslavement. Ultimately, the resistance was controlled and slavery was established for 3 million blacks in the South. Still under the most difficult conditions, under pain of mutilation and death, throughout their 200 years of enslavement in North America, these Afro-Americans continued to rebel. Only occasionally was there an organized insurrection. More often, they showed their refusal to submit by running away. Even more often, they engaged in sabotage, slowdowns, and subtle forms of resistance which asserted, if only to themselves and their brothers and sisters, their dignity as human beings. The refusal began in Africa. One slave trader reported that blacks are, quote, so willful and loth to leave their own country that they have often leapt out of the canoes, boat, and ship into the sea and kept underwater till they were drowned, end quote. When the very first black slaves were brought into Hispaniola in 1503, the Spanish governor of Hispaniola complained to the Spanish court that fugitive black slaves were teaching disobedience to the Indians. In the 1520s and 30s, there were slave revolts in Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Santa Marta, and what is now Panama. Give me a second, there's a card. Shortly after those rebellions, the Spanish established a special police for chasing fugitive slaves. A Virginia statute of 1669 referred to, quote, the obstinacy of many of them, end quote. And in 1680, the Assembly took note of slave meetings under the pretense of feasts and brawls, which they considered of dangerous consequence. In 1687, in the colony's northern neck, a plot was discovered in which slaves planned to kill all the whites in the area and escape during a mass funeral. Gerald Mullen, who studied slave resistance in the 18th century Virginia in his work Flight and Rebellion, reports, the available sources on slavery in 18th century plantation and county records, the newspaper advertisements for runaways describe rebellious slaves and few others. The slaves described were lazy and thieving. They feigned illnesses, destroyed crops, stores, tools, and sometimes attacked or unalive overseers. They operated black markets and stolen goods. Runaways were defined as various types. They were truants, who usually returned voluntarily, or outlaws, and slaves who were actually fugitive. Men who visited relatives, went to town to pass a free, or tried to escape slavery completely, either by boarding ships and leaving the colony or banding together in cooperative efforts to establish villages or hideouts in the frontier. The commitment of another type of rebellious slave was total. These men became unalivers, arsonists, and insurrectionists. Slaves recently from Africa, still holding onto the heritage of their communal society, would run away in groups and try to establish villages of runaways out in the wilderness on the frontier. Slaves born in America, on the other hand, were more likely to run off alone, and with the skills they had learned on the plantation, try to pass as free men. In the colonial papers of England in 1729 report from the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia to the British Board of Trade tells how, quote, a number of blacks, about 15, formed a design to withdraw from their master and to fix themselves in the fastnesses of the neighboring mountains. They had found means to get into their possession some arms and ammunition, and they took along with them some provisions, their clothes, cloths, bedding, and working tools. Though this attempt has happily been defeated, it ought nevertheless to awaken us into some effectual measures, end quote. Slavery was immensely profitable to some masters. James Madison told a British visitor shortly after the American Revolution that he could make $257 on every black in a year and spend only $12 or $13 on his keep. Another viewpoint was of slave owner Landon Carter, writing about 50 years earlier, complaining that his slaves were so neglected their work and were so uncooperative that he began to wonder if keeping them was worthwhile. Some historians have painted a picture based on the infrequency of organized rebellions and the ability of the South to maintain slavery for 200 years, of a slave population made submissive by their condition, with their African heritage destroyed. They were, as Stanley Elkin said, made into Sambos, a society of helpless dependence, or as another historian, Ulrich Phillips, said, quote, by racial qualities submissive, end quote. But looking at the totality of slave behavior, at the resistance of everyday life, from non-cooperation in work to running away, the picture becomes different. In 1710, warning the Virginia Assembly, Governor Alexander Spotswood said, freedom wears a cap which can, without a tongue, call together all those who long to shake off the fetters of slavery, and as such an insurrection would surely be attended with most dreadful consequences. So I think we cannot be too early in providing against it, both by putting ourselves in a better posture of defense and by making a law to prevent the consultations of those blacks. Indeed, considering the harshness of punishment for running away, that so many blacks did run away must be a sign of a powerful rebelliousness. All through the 1700s, the Virginia Slave Code read, whereas many times slaves run away and lie hid and lurking in swamps, woods, and other obscure places, killing hogs and committing other injuries to the inhabitants. If the slave does not immediately return, anyone whatsoever may kill or destroy such slaves by such ways and means as he shall think fit. If the slave is apprehended, it shall be lawful for the county court to order such punishment for the said slave, either by dismembering or in any other way, as they in their discretion shall think fit, for the reclaiming any such incorrigible slave and terrifying others from the like practices. Mullen found newspaper advertisements between 1736 and 1801 for 1,138 men runaways and 141 women. One consistent reason for running away was to find members of one's family, showing that despite the attempts of the slave system to destroy family ties by not allowing marriages and by separating families, slaves would face unalive and mutilation to get together. In Maryland, where slaves were about 1/3 of the population in 1750, slavery had been written into law since the 1660s, and statutes for controlling rebellious slaves were passed. There were cases where slave women killed their masters, sometimes by poisoning. Hold on, there's a bug. By poisoning them. What just happened? All right. By poisoning them, sometimes by burning tobacco houses and homes. Punishments range from whipping and branding to execution. But the trouble continued. In 1742, 7 slaves were put to death for murdering their master. Fear of slave revolt seems to have been a permanent fact of plantation life. William Byrd, a wealthy Virginia slave owner, wrote in 1736, we have already at least 10,000 men of these descendants of Ham fit to bear arms, and these numbers increase every day, as well by birth as by importation. And in cases there should arise a man of desperate fortune, he might with more advantage that Catiline kindle a servile war, and tinge our rivers wide as they are with blood. It was an intricate and powerful system of control that the slave owners developed to maintain their labor supply and their way of life, a system both subtle and crude, involving every device that social orders employ for keeping power and wealth where it is. As Kenneth Stamp puts it, a wise master did not take seriously the belief that blacks were natural-born slaves. He knew better. He knew that blacks freshly imported from Africa had to be broken into bondage, that each succeeding generation had to be carefully trained. This was no easy task, for the bondsman rarely submitted willingly. Moreover, he rarely submitted completely. In most cases, there was no end to the need for control, at least not until old age reduced the slave to a condition of helplessness. The system was psychological and physical at the same time. The slaves were taught discipline, were impressed again and again with the idea of their own inferiority, to know their place, to see blackness as a sign of subordination, to be awed by the power of the master, to merge their interests with the master's, destroying their own individual needs. To accomplish this, there was the discipline of hard labor, the breakup of the slave family, the lulling effects of region, the creation of disunity among slaves by separating them into field slaves and more privileged house slaves, and finally the power of law and the immediate power of the overseer to invoke whipping, burning, mutilation, and unaliving. Dismemberment was provided for in the Virginia Code of 1705. Maryland passed a law in 1723 providing for cutting off the ears of blacks who struck whites, and that for certain serious crimes slaves should be hanged and the body quartered and exposed. Wow. Still rebellions took place, not many, but enough to create constant fear among white planters. The first large-scale revolt in the North American colonies took place in New York in 1712. In New York, slaves were 10% of the population, the highest proportion in the northern states where economic conditions usually did not require large numbers of field slaves. About 25 blacks and 2 Indians set fire to a building, then killed 9 whites who came onto the scene. They were captured by soldiers, put on trial, and 21 were executed. The governor's report to England said, quote, "Some were burnt, others were hanged, one broken on the wheel, and one hung alive in chains in the town," end quote. One had been burned over a slow fire for 8 to 10 hours, all this to serve notice to other slaves. A letter to London from South Carolina in 1720 reports, "I am now to acquaint you that very lately we have had a very wicked and barbarous plot of the design of the blacks rising, with a design to destroy all the white people in the country and then to take Charlestown in full body, but it pleased God it was discovered, as many of them taken prisoners and some burnt and some hanged and some banished." Around this time were a number of fires in Boston and New Haven, suspected to be the work of slaves. As a result, one slave was executed in Boston, and the Boston Council ruled that any slaves who on their own gathered in groups of 2 or more were to be punished by whipping. At Stono, South Carolina, in 1739, about 20 slaves rebelled, killed unalived 2 warehouse guards, stole guns and gunpowder, and headed south, unaliving people in their way and burning buildings. They were joined by others until there were perhaps 80 slaves in all, and according to one account of the time, quote, "they called out liberty, marched on with colors displayed and 2 drums beating," end quote. The militia found and attacked them. In the ensuing battle, perhaps 50 slaves and 25 whites were killed before the uprising was crushed. Herbert Aptheker, who did detailed research on slave resistance in North America for his book, American Negro Slave Revolts, found about 250 instances where a minimum of 10 slaves joined in a revolt or conspiracy. From time to time, whites were involved in the slave resistance. As early as 1663, indentured white servants and black slaves in Gloucester County, Virginia, formed a conspiracy to rebel and gain their freedom. The plot was betrayed and ended with executions. Mullen reports that the newspaper notices of runaways in Virginia often warned ill-disposed whites without harboring fugitives. Sometimes slaves and free men. Sometimes slaves and free men ran off together or cooperated in crimes together. Sometimes black male slaves ran off and joined white women. From time to time, white ship captains and watermen dealt with runaways, perhaps making the slave a part of the crew. In New York in 1741, there were 10,000 whites in the city and 2,000 black slaves. It had been a hard winter, and the poor slaves and free had suffered greatly. When mysterious fires broke out, blacks and whites were accused of conspiring together. Mass hysteria developed against the accused. After a trial full of lurid accusations by informers and forced confessions, 2 white men and 2 white women were executed. 18 slaves were hanged and 13 slaves were burned alive. Only one fear was greater than the fear of black rebellion in the new American colonies. That was the fear that discontented whites would join black slaves to overthrow the existing order. In the early firmly ingrained, while white indentured servants were often treated as badly as black slaves, there was a possibility of cooperation. As Edmund Morgan sees it, there are hints that the two despised groups initially saw each other as sharing the same predicament. It was common, for example, for servants and slaves to run together, steal hogs together, get drunk together. It was not uncommon for them to make love together. In Bacon's rebellion, one of the last groups to surrender was a mixed band of 80 blacks and 20 English servants. As Morgan says, masters, quote, initially at least perceived slaves in much the same way they had always perceived servants. Shiftless, irresponsible, unfaithful, ungrateful, dishonest, end quote. End quote. If freemen with disappointed hopes should make common cause with slaves of desperate hope, the results might be worse than anything Bacon had done, end quote. And so measures were taken. About the same time that slave codes involving discipline and punishment were passed by the Virginian Assembly, Virginia's ruling class, having proclaimed that all white men were superior to black, went on to offer their social inferiors a number of benefits previously denied them. In 1705, a law was passed requiring masters to provide white servants with those indentured time was up with 10 bushels of corn, 30 shillings, and a gun, while women servants were to get 15 bushels of corn and 40 shillings. Also, the newly freed servants were to get 50 acres of land. Morgan concludes, quote, once the small planter felt less exploited by taxation and began to prosper a little, he became less turbulent, less dangerous, more respectable. He could begin to see his big neighbor not as an extortionist, but as a powerful protector of their common interests, end quote. We see now a complex web of historical threads to ensnare blacks for slavery in America. The desperation of starving settlers, the special helplessness of the displaced African, the powerful incentive of profit for slave and trader and planter, the temptation of superior status for poor whites, the elaborate controls against escape and rebellion, the legal and social punishment of black and white collaboration. Oh, we're already to the end of the chapter. The point is that the elements of this web are historical, not natural. This does not mean that they are easily dismantled. Hey, thank you for the follow. I don't know if you're in here. It means only that there is a possibility for something else under historical conditions not yet realized. And one of these conditions would be the elimination of that class exploitation which has made poor whites desperate for small gifts of status and has prevented that unity of black and white necessary for joint rebellion and reconstruction. Around 1700, the Virginia House of Burgesses declared, the Christian servants in this country for the most part consist of the worser sort of the people of Europe. and since such numbers of Irish and other nations have been brought in, of which a great many have been soldiers in the late wars, that according to our present circumstances we can hardly govern them, and if they were fitted with arms and had the opportunity of meeting together by musters, we have just reason to fear they may rise upon us. It was kind of a class consciousness, a class fear. There were things happening in early Virginia and in the other colonies to warrant it. Let me see how long I've been live. I might keep reading a little bit. 48 minutes. I'm going to go into chapter 3. All right. In 1767, 70 years after Virginia was founded, 100 years before it supplied... persons of mean and vile condition. That's the name of the chapter. In 1676, 70 years after Virginia was founded, 100 years before it supplied leadership to the for the American Revolution, that colony faced a rebellion of white frontiersmen. Joined by slaves and servants, a rebellion so threatening that the governor had to flee the burning capital of Jamestown, and England decided to send 1,000 soldiers across the Atlantic, hoping to maintain order among 40,000 colonists. This was Bacon's rebellion. After the uprising was suppressed, its leader, Nathaniel Bacon, unalive, and his associates hanged, Bacon was described in Royal Commission report. He was said to be about 4 or 5 and 30 years of age, indifferent, tall but slender, black-haired, and of ominous, pensive, melancholy aspect, of a pestilent and prevalent logical discourse tending to atheism. He seduced the vulgar and most ignorant people to believe, so that their whole hearts and hopes were set now upon Bacon. Next, he charges the governor as negligent and wicked, treacherous and incapable, the laws and taxes as unjust and oppressive as cries up absolute necessity of redress. Thus Bacon encouraged the tumult. And as the unquiet crowd follow and adhere to him, he listeth them. Scared me. He listed them as they came in upon a large paper, writing their names circular-wise, and that their ringleaders might not be found out. Having cornered them into the circle, given them brandy to wind up the charm, and enjoined them by an oath to stick fast together, and to him, and the oath being administered, he went and infected New Kent County ripe for rebellion. Bacon's rebellion began with conflict over how to deal with Indians, who were close by on the western frontier, constantly threatening. Whites who had been ignored when huge land grants around Jamestown were given away had gone west to find land, and there they encountered Indians. Were those frontier Virginians resentful that the politicos and landed aristocrats who controlled the colony's government in Jamestown first pushed them into westward Indian territory, and then seemed indecisive in fighting the Indians? That might explain the character of their rebellion, and not easily classifiable as their anti-aristocrat or anti-Indian, because it was both. And the governor, William Berkeley, and his Jamestown crowd were they more conciliatory to the Indians? Oh, got bit by a bug. Hold on. Now that they had monopolized the land in the East, could use frontier whites as a buffer and needed peace. The desperation of the government in suppressing the rebellion seemed to have a double motive: developing an Indian policy which would divide Indians in order to control them, and teaching the poor whites of Virginia that rebellion did not pay, by a show of superior force, by calling for troops from England itself, by mass hanging. Violence had escalated on the frontier before the rebellion. Some Doig Indians took a few hogs to redress a debt, and whites retrieving the hogs unalived to Indians. The Doigs then sent out a war party to unalive a white herdsman, after which a white militia company unalived 24 Indians. This led to a series of Indian raids, with the Indians outnumbered, turning to guerrilla warfare. The House of Burgesses in Jamestown declared war on the Indians, but proposed to exempt those Indians who cooperated. This seemed to anger the frontiers people, who wanted total war, but also resented the high taxes assessed to pay for the war. Times were hard in 1676. Quote, there was genuine distress, genuine poverty. All contemporary sources speak of the great mass of people as living in severe economic straits, end quote, writes Wilcombe Washburn, who, using British colonial records, has done an exhaustive study of Bacon's rebellion. It was a dry summer, ruining the corn crop, which was needed for food, and the tobacco crop needed for export. Governor Berkeley, in his 70s, tired of holding office, wrote wearily about his situation. Quote, how miserable that man is that governs a people their 6 parts of 7 at least are poor, indebted, discontented, and armed, end quote. His phrase, quote, 6 parts of 7, end quote, suggests the existence of upper class, not so impoverished. In fact, there was such a class already developed in Virginia. Bacon himself came from this class and had a good bit of land and was probably more enthusiastic about unaliving Indians than about redressing the grievances of the poor. But he became a symbol of mass resentment against the Virginia establishment and was elected in the spring of 1676 to the House of Burgesses. When he insisted on organizing armed detachments to fight the Indians outside official control, Berkeley proclaimed him a rebel and had him captured, whereupon 2,000 Virginians marched into Jamestown to support him. Berkeley let Bacon go in return for an apology, but Bacon went off, gathered his militia, and began raiding the Indians. Bacon's, quote, Declaration of the People, end quote, of July 1676 shows a mixture of populist resentment against the rich and frontier hatred of the Indians. It indicted the Berkeley administration for unjust taxes, for putting favorites in high positions, for monopolizing the beaver trade, and for not protecting the western farmers from the Indians. Then Bacon went out to attack the friendly Pamunkey Indians, unaliving 8, taking others prisoner, plundering their possessions. There is evidence that the rank and file of both Bacon's rebel army and Berkeley's official army were not as enthusiastic as their leaders. There were mass desertions on both sides, according to Washburn. In the fall, Bacon, aged 29, fell sick and unalived because of, as a contemporary put it, quote, swarms of vermin that bred in his body, end quote. A minister, apparently not a sympathizer, wrote this epitaph. Bacon is unalive. I am sorry at my heart that lice and flux should take the hangman's part. Wow, that's pretty graphic. Hold on, let me see how long I've been live here. Alright, 56 minutes. Alright, so the rebellion didn't last long after that. A ship armed with 30 guns cruising the York River became the base for securing order, and its captain, Thomas Grantham, used force and deception to disarm the last rebel forces. Coming upon the chief garrison of the rebellion, he found 400 armed Englishmen and blacks, a mixture of freedmen, servants, and slaves. He promised to pardon everyone, to give freedom to slaves and servants, whereupon they surrendered their arms and dispersed, except for 80 blacks and 20 English who insisted on keeping their arms. Grantham promised to take them to a garrison down the river, but when they got into the boat, he trained his big guns on them, disarmed them, and eventually delivered the slaves and servants to their masters. The remaining garrisons were overcome one by one. 23 rebel leaders were hanged. It was a complex chain of oppression in Virginia. The Indians were plundered by white frontiersmen who were taxed and controlled by the Jamestown elite, and the whole colony was being exploited by England, which brought the colonists tobacco at prices it dictated and made 100,000 pounds a year for the king. Berkeley himself, returning to England years earlier to protest the English Navigation Acts, which gave English merchants a monopoly of the colonial trade, had said, "We cannot but resent that 40,000 people should be impoverished to enrich little more than 40 merchants, who being the only buyers of our tobacco give us what they please for it, and after it is here sell it how they please, and indeed have 40,000 servants in us at cheaper rates than any other man have slaves." From the testimony of the governor himself, the rebellion against him had overwhelming support of the Virginia population. A member of his council reported that the defection of, quote, unquote, almost general, and laid it to, quote, the lewd dispositions of some persons of desperate fortunes, end quote, who had the vain hopes of taking the country wholly out of His Majesty's hands into their own. Another member of the governor's council, Richard Lee, noticed that Bacon's rebellion had started over Indian policy, but the, quote, zealous inclination of the multitude, end quote, to support Bacon was due, he said, to hopes of leveling. Quote unquote, leveling meant equalizing the wealth. Leveling was to be behind countless actions of poor whites against the rich in all the English colonies. In the century and a half before the Revolution, The servants who joined Bacon's rebellion were part of a large underclass of miserably poor whites who came to the North American colonies from European cities whose governments were anxious to be rid of them. In England, the development of commerce and capitalism in the 1500s and 1600s, the enclosing of land for the production of wool filled the cities with vagrant poor, and from the reign of Elizabeth on, laws were passed to punish them, imprison them in workhouses, or exile them. The Elizabethan, I don't know how you say it, definition of rogues and vagabonds included all persons calling themselves scholars going about begging, and seafaring men pretending losses of their ships or goods on the sea going about the country begging. All idle persons going about in any country either begging or using any subtile craft or unlawful games. Common players of interludes and minstrels wandering abroad. All wandering persons and common laborers being persons able in body using loitering and refusing to work for such reasonable wages as is taxed or commonly given. Such persons found begging could be stripped to the waist and whipped bloody, could be sent out of the city, sent to workhouses, or transported out of the country. In the 1600s and 1700s, by forced exile, by lures, promises, and lies, by kidnapping, by the urgent need to escape the living conditions of the home country, poor people wanting to go to America became commodities of profit for merchants, traders, ship captains, and eventually their masters in America. Abbott Smith, in his study of indentured servitude, colonists, and bondage, writes, from the complex pattern of forces producing immigration to the American colonies, one stands out clearly as most powerful in causing the movement of servants. This was the pecuniary profit to be made by shipping them. After signing the indenture, in which the immigrants agreed to pay their cost of passage by working for a master for 5 or 7 years, they were often imprisoned until the ship sailed to make sure they did not run away. In the year 1619, the Virginia House of Burgesses, born that year as the first... Hold on a second. I think I'm getting... Okay, hold on. Oh, shoot. I tried again. Apparently, I'm not reading. Okay, in the year 1619, the Virginia House of Burgesses, born that year as the first representative assembly in America, provided for the recording and enforcing of contracts between servants and masters. As in any contract between unequal powers, the parties appeared on paper as equals, but enforcement was far easier for the master than for servant. The voyage to America lasted 8, 10, or 12 weeks, and the servants were packed into ships with the same fanatic concern for profits that marked the slave ships. If the weather was bad and the trip took too long, they ran out of food. The sloop Seaflower, leaving Belfast in 1741, was at sea 16 weeks, and when it arrived in Boston, 46 of its 106 passengers were unalive of starvation, 6 of them eaten by the survivors. On another trip, 32 children died of hunger and disease and were thrown into the ocean. Gottlieb Mittelberger, a musician traveling from Germany to America around 1750, wrote about his voyage. He wrote, During the journey, the ship is full of pitiful signs of distress, smells, fumes, horrors, vomiting, various kinds of seasickness, fever, dysentery, headaches, heat, constipation, boils, scurvy, cancer, mouth rot, and similar afflictions, all of them caused by the age and the high salted state of the food, especially of the meat, as well as by the very bad and filthy water. Add to all that shortage of food, hunger, thirst, frost, heat, dampness, fear, misery, vexation, and lamentation, as well as other troubles. On board our ship, on a day on which we had a great storm, a woman about to give birth and unable to deliver under these circumstances was pushed through one of the portholes in the sea. Wow. Indentured servants were brought and sold like slaves. An announcement in the Virginia Gazette March 28, 1771 read, "Just arrived at Leedstown, the ship Justitia, with about 100 healthy servants, men, women, and boys. The sail will commence on Tuesday, the 2nd of April." Again, the rosy accountants of better living standards in the Americas, one must place many others like one immigrant's letter from America. "Whoever is well off in Europe better remain there. Here is misery and distress, same as everywhere, and for certain persons and conditions incomparably more than in Europe. Beatings and whippings were common. Servant women were raped. One observer testified, 'I have seen an overseer beat a servant with a cane about the head till the blood has followed, for a fault that is not worth the speaking of.' The Maryland court records showed many servant self-unalivings. In 1671, Governor Berkeley of Virginia reported that in previous years, 4 of 5 servants unalived a disease after their arrival. Many were poor children, gathered up by the hundreds on the streets of English cities and sent to Virginia to work. The master tried to control completely the sexual lives of the servants. It was in his economic interest to keep women servants from marrying or having sexual relations because childbearing would interfere with work. Benjamin Franklin, writing as quote-unquote Poor Richard in 1736, gave advice to his readers, "Let thy maidservant be faithful, strong, and homely." Servants could not marry without permission, could be separated from their families, could be whipped for various offenses. Pennsylvania law in the 17th century said that marriage of servants, quote, "without the consent of the masters shall be proceeded against as for adultery or fornication, and children to be reputed as bastards," end quote. Although colonial laws existed to stop excesses against servants, they were not very well enforced. We learn from Richard Morris's comprehensive study of early court records in government and labor in early America. Servants did not participate in juries, masters did. In 1666, a New England court accused a couple of the unaliving of a servant after the mistress had cut off the servant's toes. The jury voted acquittal. In Virginia in the 1660s, a master was convicted of raping 2 women servants. He was also known to beat his own wife and children. He had whipped and chained another servant until he unalived. The master was berated by the court, but specifically cleared on the rape charge despite overwhelming evidence. Sometimes servants organized rebellions, but one did not find on the mainland the kind of large-scale conspiracies of servants that existed. For instance, on the Barbados in the West Indies. For instance, on Barbados in the West Indies. However, in York County, Virginia, in 1661, a servant named Isaac Friend proposed to another, after much dissatisfaction with the food, that they, quote, "get a matter of 40 of them together and get guns, and he would be the first and lead them and cry as they went along, who would be for liberty and free from bondage, and that there would enough come to them, and they would go through the country and unalive those that made any opposition, and that they would either be free or unalive for it," end quote. The scheme was never carried out, but 2 years later in Gloucester County, servants again planned a general uprising. One of them gave the plot away, and 4 were executed. The informer was given his freedom and 5,000 pounds of tobacco. Despite the rarity of servants' rebellions, the threat was always there, and masters were fearful. Finding their situation intolerable and rebellion impractical in an increasingly organized society, servants reacted in individual ways. The files of the county courts in New England showed that one servant struck at his master with a pitchfork. An apprentice servant was accused of laying violent hands upon his master and throwing him down twice and fetching blood of him, threatening to break his neck, running at his face with a chair. One maidservant was brought into court for being bad, unruly, sullen, careless, destructive, and disobedient. After the participation of servants in Bacon's rebellion, the Virginian legislature passed laws to punish servants who rebelled. The preamble to the act said, whereas many evil-disposed servants in these late times of horrid rebellion, taking advantage of the looseness of liberty of the time, did depart from their service, and followed the rebels in rebellion, wholly neglecting their masters' employment, whereby the said masters have suffered great damage and injury. 2 companies of English soldiers remained in Virginia to guard against future trouble, and their presence was defended in a report to the Lords of Trade and Plantation, saying, quote, Virginia is at present poor and more populous than ever. There is a great apprehension of a rising among the servants, owing to their great necessities and want of clothes. They may plunder the storehouses and ships. Let me see how long I've been on here. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop right there, but I'm gonna read it again in case you missed the first. I got this one's, I think, is kind of a long chapter. 258. Yeah, I still got 13 pages left, so I'm going to end it right there. I may get back on later and read some more, but we're going to start again on chapter 2 tomorrow, and maybe even start at chapter 1 and read through chapter 2, and we'll go from there. But I appreciate everybody that came by and listened. I'll be reading some more. Be sure and give me a follow, and we'll keep doing this. I'm going to read the whole book, and just so everybody will know what actually, this is real American history. This ain't even the new book that they sell on TikTok. This is the older edition. This is the old People's History of the United States. This is like this is like 1990s edition. This is not the one you see on TikTok. This is this is probably 20 years old. But I appreciate everybody for coming, and I will see y'all next time. Ending the live.